Let's move on to take a look at how popular sovereignty might play out in some of the political cartoons that you have on your sheet here. You have two political cartoons. On the left, in really bold type, your vote is your voice, and then of course the person screaming into what looks like a megaphone but says ballot on it, be heard. And then on the right hand side we have the caption, 2/3 of eligible Texans don't vote, and the image where you have 2/3 of the people shown in the picture saying we didn't vote because it won't make a difference. Now what I'd like you to do is take a minute or two, look at those cartoons, and think about what those cartoons might mean, and explain it in relation to the principle of popular sovereignty and representative government. You should be writing something down at this point. Alright, check what you've written now. It should be similar to, but does not have to be word for word, to what I've just brought up on the screen. In order for a democracy to work, in order for power to come from the people and for the people to rule, they have to exercise that power. There's a need for participation. There was a great reference in one of the readings yesterday that talked about how the founders believed that the only just government was based on, the consent of the people, right? The consent of the governed, that, you show your consent by that voting process. But the other side of that is that there's a belief that citizens have to be worthy of that authority. You have to exercise your right to vote if you want things to change. And so that's essentially, where these two political cartoons are coming from. That, there has to be participation in order for there to be a working, functioning democracy. Let's move on to our second principle here, which we've just sort of referenced with the consent of the governed. Principle 1 and Principle 2, popular sovereignty and the consent of the governed, are closely linked, clearly. Right? Consent of the governed means, specifically, the approval of, who's the governed? The people again. So consent means approval, and the governed would be, of course, the citizens. Let's fill that in there so we have that breakdown. And like we've referenced with those political cartoons, the concept cannot work without the government needing the approval of the people. If the government could essentially do whatever it wanted, if we didn't have the right to vote, if we didn't have the right to freely protest, then the government could essentially do whatever it wanted, and that would not have worked out then either. That would not be a functioning democracy. So there is the need of the approval of the people baked into the Constitution. And we see that in the form of, again, that popular sovereignty, that voting. So let's add those notes here. All right, let's move on to our third principle for the day, and where we'll sort of stop today anyway, and that's Principle 3, the idea of separation of the powers. Once again, as referenced when we broke down the structure of the Constitution, the separation of powers exists so that each branch, and remember, if you need to, what are those three branches there? Think back to that. Hopefully you thought legislative, executive, and judicial. But each branch has powers that are distinct from one another, however, also equal to the other branches. And that's where the founders also baked into the system this inherent checks and balances. That'll be part of our conversation on principles tomorrow. So let's fill in what we're missing here. Each branch has powers distinct, meaning separate from. So if we need to add that, we can do that. Distinct from or separate from one another and equal to each other. So they are both quite powerful. And then what I would like us to do is we're going to fill in what those basic jobs, roles are of those branches. So we have a little table here. And as I said earlier, this is just a small taste of what we're going to focus on later in the year. We'll spend all unit talking about the legislative branch, a unit talking about the executive, and then finally a unit about the judicial. But here we have a basic breakdown, so let's add this in. For legislative, we want to note that Congress is making the laws. And where do we see this again? In Article 1. Now, in terms of the executive, we have the concept of the president enforcing the laws. And we see that in Article 2. So let's fill that in. And finally, we have the judicial branch, where we have the interpretation of the laws. The Supreme Court is the court that interprets the Constitution. Excuse me. And then, of course, in general, we have the whole system of courts, federal and state, their structure, how they operate and interact with one another. And we see that laid out in Article 3. So let's add those notes here. And that brings us to the end of our conversation today, anyway, on these three main principles. So you have a quick background information on the Constitution itself, why it was so revolutionary, breakdown of its basic structure, and then we've talked about popular sovereignty, consent of the governed, and separation of powers. Tomorrow, we will take a look at federalism more closely, checks and balances, limited government, and individual rights. At this point, your notes for the day are done. So what I want you to do now is you're going to go back to Schoology, and you're going to take a look at, I've uploaded a study guide or review guide, whatever you want to call it, for our quiz on Tuesday that you can download and use. And what I would like you to do for the rest of this period is to work on studying for that. You can make flashcards, you can simply look over your notes, write down stuff that you want. If you can, one of the great ways to study is to come up with questions that you think might be asked and then to answer those questions. So you can come up with some key questions as well. And I'm going to leave a spot too where you can actually give me your questions, because we're going to play a game of Kahoot next week. and your question might show up in the game, possibly. So if you've come up with some good questions and you want to share them, please do that on the document that you'll see in Schoology. Okay, thank you.